It's my pleasure to introduce our Rutherford medalist, Professor Rod Downey.
Thank you. Well, thanks for braving the weather and coming here. It's really nice to see so many people here. This is the last talk I'm giving in Wellington, and hopefully it's a reasonably good one. We'll see. Okay, so logic, maths in modern society. I'd like to talk about the following. So, I love this quote. The book of nature is writ in the language of mathematics. It's by Galileo. It's one of these things we should treasure. So I'll try and support this statement, and I'll try and support even a stronger statement that what we do is, what mathematicians do is really important for you, and I'll try and explain why I think that's true. Okay, so what's my plan? So my plan is, so what do mathematicians actually do? It may sound like a dumb question, but I think, most people's experience for mathematics, if they don't go on with anything further, is somehow being beaten at university, at school, with maybe calculus or something like that, and maybe that's what you think it's all about, but I'll try and explain what mathematicians do nowadays, and I'll try and explain what logic is and why I care, and perhaps why you should care. I'll try and say, where did it come from? Where did mathematics come from, and where did logic come from, and what's the history of this subject? So in the next hour, we'll try and do 3,700 years. And I'll try and explain why I think it's actually currently the backbone of modern society. We are in the most mathematical age of all time. I'll give a couple of examples, and particularly a couple of examples from my own work. Of course, I won't bore you by talking about details of my own work, but I'll try and give you some indications of perhaps where it's been used, much to my surprise. Okay, so one of the things I like to reflect on, though, when I was preparing these talks, I was reflecting upon what it is. What research is useful? What does that mean? So it's pretty clear. What I want to reflect on, it's pretty clear that it's hard for even the experts to anticipate what will prove to be important. And I'll give a couple of examples of this in this talk. And I realise that in New Zealand, most of us probably think of research as something like this, right? I really love this picture because this was when I first came to New Zealand, because I was originally from Australia. I looked in one of the local science books and I opened this page and I thought, this is fantastic. I've got to get that photo. Here's your quiz. Where did it come from? So it's Lincoln. Right, so most people said Massey, but no, it's Lincoln. It's the other one, right? And this is a CT scan, a helical CT scan of a sheep, probably the sheep's brain. Probably doesn't occur to many other places. Probably they were scanning it for fat, actually. So mathematics, what do we do? And ultimately, when I was doing this talk, I was thinking to myself, what do we really do, and how can I explain it? And I think that it's fair to say that I think mathematicians, their job is to build symbolic models of the universe. And I don't necessarily mean the physical universe, as you'll see, I mean other kinds of universes. But we build symbolic models, and the idea is we can manipulate those models and make predictions or explain why things happen, things like that, right? And of course, therefore we're providing tools to physicists and chemists and biologists and whatever, but ultimately, I think what mathematicians do is they're trying to build models of the universe. So early on, the Egyptians, the Babylonians, Greeks, Chinese, and Incas, and so forth, they invented geometry to help them with building and explain the motions of the cosmos. Would make sense. They and others invented methods of calculating interest because you want people to pay you money, right? I mean, that stands to reason. Later from physics, one of the great things that Newton and Leibniz and others did was they invented differential equations. Now, we won't be studying differential equations, but they're used to describe rates of change. So if you're analysing what's happening as time goes on, you're studying equations which study things changing with time. And basically, if you go back and look at that CT scan, CT actually stands for computed tomography. Computed tomography. It's not really all about taking pictures. It's actually about the analysis of what's happening. A beam is sent through the sheep, and then at the other side, we analyse how the interference pattern works and do an inverse problem to figure out what the image was. Right? Computed tomography. I'm going to look at one example from my own work. And in my own work, I'm going to stick with a fairly simple example a model which is graphs. So graphs are something that we teach in first year mathematics at Victoria University. And these are abstract models consisting of points, dots, another dot, and lines between them, which we call edges because we're mathematicians. And these are abstract models of many situations. For example, the points might be people. I might have an edge relation between them if they're friends, or if they share a common interest in macrame or something like that, right? Or, and then what I might do is, if I was using friends, I might cluster edit, which means I might do some sampling and have a look at all these people, and I might say, oh, look, there's a group of people who have a common interest in backgammon. Now, if I'm a search engine, I might want to target backgammon ads towards people who have an interest in backgammon. So those evil algorithms out there which are targeting you for things, that's what they're doing, is that they're cluster editing. But on the other hand, it might be the dots might represent bits of DNA. And I might connect them if they're somehow associated with some disease or something like that, the expression of some disease. And we might be figuring out the cause of that disease because we might look for clusters which commonly express certain things. So, or it might be bits of music. So people have actually done this. You get bits of music and you go, well, okay, did Bach pinch from the Scots? Probably, right? Or something like that. So you can analyse bits of music and see how similar they are. So this is again using graph theory. Here are some examples. Anyone know what this is? Singapore. And of course you can see that this abstract model of a graph would be quite useful to you because, well, I might want to figure out how to get from, say, this point to this point with the smallest number of trains or something like that. So it's a common graph problem I might want to solve. This is the whole internet, right? So it's not really the whole, it's a picture of the whole internet, right? So it's an abstract model of the whole internet. And I think these coloured things are little clusters, right? So what's the point of this abstraction? Okay. Well, I think the thing is no matter if we understand properties of certain kinds of graphs, no matter what the application, those properties will hold. If I model some situation with a certain kind of graph and I understand that kind of graph, then I'll know all about that problem. I don't have to worry about what the application is. It's application independent. And Mike Fellows and I, long ago, I'll mention a bit more about it later, but we developed certain kinds of complexity, certain kinds of algorithmics to understand certain kinds of graphs, and this enabled new algorithms for things like cluster editing. Now, I'll just mention a couple of these things in a second, but what is an algorithm? I'll have to get to this later, but an algorithm for baking a cake would be a recipe. I give you the recipe, I follow the recipe, and then at the end I've got my cake. Or when you do your tax return, if you still do your tax return at the end of the year, you follow the algorithm at the end and it tells you how much you owe, or maybe how much they owe you, if you're lucky. Or I look like saying assembling flat furniture, right? You know, these flat pack furnitures. We all know that if you follow the instructions precisely, you'll get the answer, right? Actually, as I said on Thursday, I was extremely pleased that my eldest son was visiting from CMU, Carnegie Mellon. He's a computer scientist. He prides himself on his ability to assemble such furniture, and he screwed up. It gave me an immense joy. And then I had to fix it, which was actually kind of annoying. Because these things, once you get them together, this particular one, you couldn't get it apart. I had to get in with a crowbar. Okay, or it could be something formal like this. This is it doesn't matter what it is. I got it off the internet. This is a bit of C++ code. These are the kinds of things that occur within computers. You give little instructions. Each one of these doesn't do much in itself, but when you assemble these tiny instructions together, you get the computer to hopefully bend to your will in some sense. So what are some applications of my own work? And again, these are not direct applications, but applications of the approach. So Mike Langston, he has a team that he's assembled at the University of Tennessee, and what he does is he gets together computer scientists and teaches them biology, and biologists and teaches them computer science, so that when they graduate together, they have abilities in both areas. And one of his studies was prostate cancer. So it doesn't really matter what this picture is, but what's happening is you're putting stuff in this area, in this side, you're following it through, and you're making a graph here. And then you extract these cliques, these areas, you cluster edit to extract cliques of commonality. And from that, you can figure out what the things are which are causing prostate cancer in the genomes. So this is the application which was used. So this was run on something called the Kraken supercomputer, because he has access to it. Well, I don't think we have such things here, except unless you're Peter Jackson. I think he has the largest supercomputer cluster in the Southern Hemisphere for making Avatar and things like that. This took a week to run, I think, on a supercomputer. So it was really very big data. It was out-of-core data. Out-of-core means that it's too big to input into the computer all at once, which is really interesting. Anyway, so if you come here, this was an example of some of the data which came out, or some of the results. And what you have to see here is here's a cluster. They found these two clusters. There was particularly this one were things which were all related, okay? So once you have these enormous amounts of data going in, then you do the analysis, and having done the analysis, you can extract the clusters and perhaps explain the reasons behind, the genomic reasons behind prostate cancer. And other applications I'd like to mention, this was done by Peter Shaw. He's at Massey in Palmerston. Faisal comes from Lebanon. Robin Mast she's from Rutherford University in Australia, and Heidi Vaught-Smith, she's from the Northern Territory. And they were studying otitis media, which is an ear infection in Northern Territory, Australia, and also other parts of the world. 30% of Aboriginal children are deaf from this, functionally deaf from it. And when you get it badly, you get really rotten ears, maggots and things. It's terrible. 97.5% of Indigenous inmates in the prisons in the Northern Territory have this disease. So it's incredible. It doesn't respond to current treatment. And they don't know why. And some of the work that we did was applied again to try and understand what things were. And what they do know is it's a multi-pathogen disease, which means it's lots and lots of things interacting. So again, you had to seek cliques to figure out what was going on. Traditional statistical methods did not work. And this group discovered again that they found a way of actually showing of explaining what was going on. And again, if you stare at this picture for a while, you get to see little clusters which they found. I'm not going to talk about this, but if you're interested, I think you should talk to Peter Shaw. It's really fascinating work, and it shows a lot of promise. So, what was I talking about? Well, okay. So I would claim a lot of stuff which happens today, and I'm going to follow this story, follows from work in logic, mathematical logic. So I really like this quote, Moshavadi. Cosma L.R. Shalizi from the Santa Fe Institute said, if in 1901 a talented and sympathetic outsider had been called upon by, say, a granting agency like the Marsden Fund or something like that, to name a branch of science that will be the least fruitful in the century ahead, he might well have settled upon mathematical logic, an exceedingly recondite field whose practitioners could have all fit into a small auditorium. It had no practical applications, not even much mathematics to show for itself. Its crown was an extremely obscure definition of cardinal numbers. And I will mention cardinal numbers are actually varieties of infinity. There's Aleph Nord, Aleph 1, and so forth. So, move ahead to 1988. So Martin Davis was he's a famous computer scientist and logician. He said, when I was a student, even the topologists, and they are strange people, regarded mathematical logicians as living in outer space. Today, the connections between logic and computers are a matter of engineering practice at every level of computer organisation. So it's a really good idea. For example, it's a really good idea to make sure the stuff you're using works and doesn't break down. As we have seen tragically recently with these planes falling out of the sky, it wasn't a hardware error, it was a software error in there. Had they been verified correctly, that wouldn't have happened, right? So Yuri Gurevich from Microsoft was quoted as saying, engineers need logic, not calculus. And these slides will be put up. You can follow, I hope that some people follow this up, because there's a beautiful paper called The Unusual Effectiveness of Logic in Computer Science explaining how this works and why there's connections there. So what is logic? Formal logic. So I'm meaning formal logic here. Logic studies principles of correct reasoning. So what's the idea? Well, in the same way as I represented people by dots and join them by edges, the idea is I want to represent reasoning and knowledge. I want to represent reasoning and knowledge by symbols, right? In the same way we did for graphs. And then you can manipulate the symbols using rules of inference, depending on the logics, to make conclusions. So there are a whole bunch, there are millions of logics. Logics include modal logics to understand possible worlds. It's possible that P is true. Heavily in forms of, so this is used lots and lots of times in program verification. I have some program that I'm trying to understand, is it true or does it work? So I'm trying to understand what's possible in the future. There are things called quantum logics, which you might guess are used from quantum physics. There are fuzzy logics. And as I've said before, when I was a young student at university, one of my professors told me fuzzy logics was an example of mathematical pornography, right? Because, you know, how could this is such rubbish, you know? All those washing machines that know how much clothes you got. Mm-hmm. People took it seriously, implemented fuzzy logic circuits, and lo and behold, big industries rely on fuzzy logics. There are things called threshold logics, which are used in neural nets. Neural nets are behind all of these algorithms you see that learn. Reinforcement learning and neural nets. Logic, I will say, is the part of mathematics that takes language seriously, which is kind of interesting because we couldn't really talk about, I mean, language is important for making concepts move around, right? We don't have symbolic representation of concepts, what can we do? Logic is the part of mathematics which takes that seriously and tries to, in the same way as understanding differential equations, it tries to understand the mathematics of reasoning. Okay, so you're now enrolled in Math 161. So I'm going to talk about so this is the mathematical bit, sorry. So the simplest system, and I'll say why this is interesting. Well, why it's interesting to me. Okay, so this is the simplest system. It was invented by George Boole at the beginning of the 19th century. And it's called propositional logic. A proposition is a statement that's either true or false. For example, if I could let N represent the statement, New Zealand has a national government, that's a statement and it happens to be false. And what we're doing is we're looking at the internal logic of these things by having connectives. So this is P and Q. So if P is true and Q is true, then P and Q is true. Otherwise, it's false, right? This is P or Q. This is P not P. This is whenever P is true, Q is true. There are these connectives. And it doesn't really matter exactly what the truth tables are, but there's this formal tableau method of determining the validity of statements. Now, we can test these statements in this logic. We want to know are they true or false. So here's a statement. If Jane is a scout, then Fred is a pilot. Jane is a scout. Therefore, Fred is a pilot. Right. So because we're mathematicians, we represent this as J implies F. J is true, therefore F is true. Okay, so this is called modus ponens, and it's a basic reasoning principle in this system. Now notice the argument below is not true. If Jane is a scout, then Fred is a pilot. Fred is a pilot. Therefore Jane is a scout. Right? Because this is a fallacy of formal reasoning called post hoc ergo propter hoc. It's a Latin thing. Actually, you know, when I remember when I came to university, you know, everyone was saying mathematics was so hard and all this, and they said, well, you never did Latin. But to see it's not true, just think of a cat thinking this. If I'm a dog, then I have 4 legs. I have 4 legs, therefore I'm a dog. That's not true, because it's a cat. Now, you may say, who on earth would ever make a mistake with such reasoning? How could it be possible? How could someone who's educated, like a judge, make a mistake? So L'Aquila is a seismologically active area of Italy, and background earthquakes of magnitude less than 2.5 are quite common. There was a series of earthquakes which occurred, very low-level earthquakes, and 6 seismologists were called in to analyse this, and they concluded this area is an area of high seismic risk. Earthquake swarms are common, rarely leading to large earthquakes. Nothing indicated that this was different. 6 days later, 6 magnitude earthquake hit. Lots of people died, lots of people are injured, the worst earthquake in 30 years. These people were put on trial. These people were tried. They were convicted. And the judge said an assessment of the risk was incomplete, inept, unsuitable, and criminally mistaken. Criminally mistaken. Public outcry, well, not public, but at least by worldwide outcry. Eventually, they're all acquitted. But it was a fundamental flaw in logic that was going on here. 50% of earthquakes are preceded by foreshocks. So that says if you have an earthquake, then you have a foreshock. The judge concluded since there was a foreshock, there would be an earthquake. They were saying, if there's an earthquake, then there's a foreshock. Aha, there was a foreshock. Therefore, there was an earthquake. And it was just a fundamental fallacy of formal logic that someone who... anyway. So it was really using, again, fuzzy logic, of course, about these are probability statements. But I'd like to point out that these things are important. So anyway, let's go back to the story. Well, okay. So let's suppose I have a bigger statement. How do I do it? Well, I do it much the same way. I just simply keep putting these values in and evaluating the truth table. But what I want to point out here is this truth table has this true line and everything else is false. We call this thing satisfiable because there's a way of making these variables giving values to make it true. Okay? Satisfiable if at least one line's true. Now, this truth table has 3 variables, so it has 8 lines. If it had 4 variables, it would have 16 lines. If it had 5 variables, it would have? 32. Very good. 10? 1,024. 100,000? A lot. A lot. A huge amount, right? Too many to fit in the universe. Right. Now, you may say, why do we care about this? I mean, this is just trivial logic. It has nothing to do with anything aside from judges. Well, do you want to become rich and famous? Right? Well, the satisfiability problem asks for an efficient method to determine if one of these statements is true. But we've got a method, truth tables. What's the problem? Well, the problem is if we did have 100,000 variables, we couldn't draw the truth table. So, on the other hand, we can guess if one of these things is, we can guess a satisfying assignment and quickly check that line. We could just substitute them in and go, aha, I know what the answer is. The P not equal to NP conjecture says that there is no efficient method taking, for example, 100 cubed many steps. Strictly speaking, polynomial time and the number of variables, but let's not worry about that. And if you could answer this question yes or no, you can win yourself $1 million. Why is such a strange thing of interest? I mean, like, propositional logic, who cares? I mean, you know, it's just something we taught your first year students with, or maybe, actually, propositional logic is the building blocks inside of computers. I haven't got time to do that, but... well, if P equaled NP in I'm going to say a reasonable way, it's possible that P might equal NP, but the polynomial might have power like n to the power of 25 billion, in which case it wouldn't be very useful. But let's pretend that it takes time, you know, quadratic or something. If P equal NP reasonably, all modern crypto systems would be insecure. All banking would fall apart. All internet security would fall apart. All of these things. Because we know that we can prove that all of these problems, all of the ways we do public key encryption can be converted into instances of satisfiability. So if we could solve that thing efficiently, we could decrypt efficiently. Well, that's not so good. On the other hand, lots and lots of things would become very useful, very efficient. We could timetable things really efficiently. Wellington bus timetable could be done almost perfectly, right? All these things would become super efficient. So there would be these amazing things that would happen. Voice recognition, scheduling, all of these things done very quickly. And just while I'm on it, let me just mention these as examples, just because I want you to understand how much mathematics there is behind everything. Coding theory allows us to send things through channels. Through this channel here, wherever it is, through this HDMI cable, I'm sending digital signals and they're being encrypted, or they're being encoded and decoded. You know, when I send anything digital, and modern life would be impossible without this coding theory. This was invented by Hamming in the mid-20th century, so it's a very recent invention. And the engineers didn't believe it. He invented things called Hamming codes now, of course, because we call them Hamming codes. Oh, woo. Invented Hamming codes, and he was saying, look, I can send this, and even though there are errors, I can correct it. And he, you know, these people said, no, you can't do that. And he said, yes, I can. And now it's a basis of modern life. Anything we do, barcodes, internet, digital, anything you want to ever think about, all of it uses error correcting codes. And cryptography. This is, I want to send a message from here to there, and I don't want people to know what I've sent. You know, it's important, and that would be, modern life would be impossible without public key encryption. We'd have to find other things to do. So public key encryption, interesting, was actually invented in 1973 by the British Secret Service. They could see no use for it. So they never, and then when, in 1977, Daffy and, anyway, there was a paper in 77 where it was announced, Daffy-Hellman, and they said, oh, actually we invented that, but you know, we'd never said anything. Modern life would be impossible without banking, cell phones, internet, anything involving security would be impossible without this. And this uses number theory. These are just words, but these are areas of mathematics. Number theory, group theory, algorithmic randomness, complexity theory. And there's a famous quote of Hardy, because a lot of his work is used in cryptography, from a book called The Mathematician's Apology. And he said, nothing I do will ever be useful. He would be rolling in his grave, because to discover some of the stuff he did was actually useful. And of course it's useful. I mean, the point is that when you study fundamental things, you just, and you understand them, things, they turn out to be useful. It's just the way things work. So back to graphs. Okay. So the first explicit use of graphs, because I want to explain complexity theory a little bit further. The first explicit use of graphs was by Leonhard Euler. Euler was one of the greatest mathematicians of all time, and he was the court mathematician back in the day, St. Petersburg. So back in the day, you had a jester, and you had a court jester, and you had the dance master, and all that kind of thing. And you have a mathematician. You know, this is your pet mathematician, and they had a very good pet here. This was like the A-grade pet, right? This guy was really good. And so he had thousands and thousands of papers, you know. Some of them were published in reverse order because he didn't have to get them through referees. He just used to write them and throw them onto this pile, and they'd collect a bundle and, you know, publish them. And some of them were published in reverse order because he'd work on later stuff, and then that would appear before the stuff at the bottom of the pile. It was... And he was asked this question, the Königsberg Bridge problem, which was, is it possible for me to travel over, these are the 7 bridges of, well, however many bridges it is, 7 bridges, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 7 bridges of Königsberg. Is it possible for me to go over these bridges exactly once. Can I start here and go here, and then maybe here, and here, and here, and then here, here. Oh, whoops, I haven't covered over this one. And he looked at this problem and said, aha, well, actually, this has got nothing to do with the bridges. You could just think about these landmasses as points, which we now know to call vertices, because we're mathematicians. And these bridges are not bridges, they're lines, which we now know to call edges, because we're mathematicians. And the question is, nowadays we'd say, is there an Euler path or an Euler cycle through these things? Can I go through all the edges exactly once? Oh. And he realised this was just a tiny part of a huge number of questions, and he proved this theorem, because that's one of the things we do. We prove theorems, and theorems are statements that we prove, because we're mathematicians. And he said a path through all the edges exactly once, returning to where you start, is called an Euler cycle. And Euler proved a connected multigraph has an Euler cycle if and only if all the vertices have even degrees. Now, why is that interesting? Well, let's look at this example. I go, odd. No, there isn't one. That's the end. I've just solved the problem. So that's a very fast algorithm, because I just count the number of edges coming out of here and discover it's 3 and say the answer is no. And he proved another theorem, which I didn't write here. I have an Euler path if and only if all the vertices have even degree except 2. And the path must start at one and finish at the other. Does this thing have an Euler path? I go, oh, it's got odd, odd, odd. No. So it's a very, very, very quick algorithm to answer the question. On the other hand, there's another kind of thing called a Hamilton cycle, which is I want to go through every vertex exactly once. Now, this is a kind of interesting thing, because if I give you a map and I'm planning a tour through a country, I might want to go to every city exactly once. I don't really like going back to, I've been there, I've done that, I don't want to come back. So can I go through every city exactly once without returning to any one I came back to? Now, it's pretty clear that, in this one the answer is yes, because I can simply start here and go here, then here, then here, then here, then here. So that looks even easier, doesn't it? Actually, it's not, because we don't know of any way of determining if something has a Hamilton tour or Hamilton cycle without trying all possibilities. Now, this is a not very complicated graph, but it does have one. You go around here, then 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 here. But if I didn't give you that, it would be possibly quite difficult to find that. If this had 100,000 vertices, trying all possibilities will take a long time. Now, what's really interesting is this problem can be converted into satisfiability. Remember that satisfiability problem? They are the same problem. Mathematicians can show that these two problems are different, in some sense, different representations of the same problem. If you give me a Hamilton cycle, I'll give you an instance of satisfiability. This thing has a Hamilton cycle if and only if this is satisfiable. If I give you an instance of satisfiability, I can give you a graph. This thing is satisfiable if and only if this thing has a Hamilton cycle. So it's this very strange thing. There's this computational method of converting one problem to another problem. Right? So the core problem in complexity theory is, I know a way to do the task algorithmically, try all possibilities. How can I prove this is the best or the most efficient method for the task? And what do I mean by that anyway? What is the best method? Is there a best method? We can actually show there are things which don't have best methods, which is a kind of interesting fact. That's called the Bloom speed-up theorem. And how do I find better algorithms, right? I don't know. This is a very interesting question. So these are the kinds of things, the issues we deal with. So I'm going to mention a paradox, and that's the following. We now know ways of converting many, literally thousands of problems into instances of satisfiability. So this really obscure problem about Boolean variables and Boolean logic turns out to be a core problem. 50 years of research has generated modern SAT solvers. So these are things that algorithmic engineers have designed to solve. So these people said, yeah, okay, so it's NP complete, it looks hard, but let's just have a go at solving it. And then they worked on it for years and years, and now they have these quite efficient SAT solvers. Right? And in fact, in real life, in many real life problems like robot navigation, these SAT solvers work beautifully. They work using techniques from computational learning theory and linear algebra, right? And amazingly enough, they work very well. In fact, the rover mission on Mars and all that uses SAT solvers for the navigation. We have no idea why they work. This is a problem I've been thinking about for 20 years. I sat down and tried to solve it, and I failed dismally, but it's a problem that I might make some progress on. We have no idea why they work. I really love this question. It's something which it's a really exciting question, could have massive impact, even though it's about apparently very obscure things. If we understood why they worked, we would understand when we could design algorithms to work efficiently. Why do they work efficiently? And this is just at a very recent, so this is the communications of the Association for Computer Machinery. It's one of the core CS journals. It says, the need for deeply understanding when algorithms work or not has never been greater. This is something these smart young people over there could probably solve, let's hope, one day. I look forward to that, because it's something that, it's really an important problem. And the thing is, we literally have no idea. Well, sometimes we do. So I was fascinated by this kind of question, and I met someone called Mike Fellows who came to New Zealand. Why did he come to New Zealand? So we had a conference in Palmerston North. Yes, I know they have conferences in Palmerston North. And this was a long time ago. This was before the advent of Marsden Fund and stuff. So if there was a conference in New Zealand, trust you me, you went to it, because there was no research funding at all. So in math, there was like 3 conferences a year, and that was it. So there happened to be one in Palmerston North. I went to Palmerston North. I heard this guy give a talk. I said, gee, that was a really interesting talk. I was reading about something like what you were talking about. I was reading this paper recently. And he looked at me and said, oh, I wrote that paper. And I felt really kind of stupid. Why did he come to New Zealand, you may say? He saw a movie called The Endless Summer. New Zealand was in The Endless Summer. Do you want to know what The Endless Summer was about? It's a surfing movie. He had wanted to come to surf New Zealand. And he thought, oh, well, I can go to a conference and I can get funding. We met. Serendipity was a great thing. And we started talking. And one of the questions we kind of asked, which is, when is it the case the only thing you know about a problem is its size? Because traditional complexity viewed a problem as follows. You have this combinatorial explosion, 2 to the 100,000. You feed in this thing, and the thing goes kaboom, right? It's too hard to solve. But in fact, that's because the only thing you know is its size. And the answer is cryptography is the only thing with that, and that's by design. By design, you only know the size of the message. Whereas we said, well, what happens? I mean, maybe we can kind of find out why things are hard. It could be hard because of one small part of the problem. And if we can then control the size of that part of the problem, then we can have things that work well. So this is what we call parameterized complexity, because we started looking at things where we had parameters we could control and then develop a complexity theory. So the problem is, then we'd have this discourse with the problem. We'd say, okay, well, we can't solve it in general. What happens if we control this? Oh, that's still bad. Well, we won't do that one. What if we control this? Oh, that might work. And so this led to a new method of algorithm design, and also a new way of thinking about problems. And much to our surprise, and as I love to say about this, this has actually turned out to be useful. As my wife once said to me, you mean you did something useful? And I said, it wasn't my fault. We were just interested. We were interested in some mathematics, and because we couldn't tell in advance that this was going to be useful. In fact, we were studying something that Jeff Whittle at the back there knows very well quasi-ordering theory of sequences, of infinite sequences of finite graphs. Now, this is an extremely obscure area of mathematics. But it turned out to have, once we studied it long enough, we realised it had very broad applications and implications. I like this quote. This is by Henri Poincaré, one of the great French mathematicians. It's by logic we prove, by intuition we discover. And I think mathematicians have this generic intuition about what's important. We study things not, I mean, look, I love the people that invented wheels on aircraft luggage. That's an amazing invention. It's made my life so much happier, right? It's such a good thing, right? But not everything, but also sometimes you just follow your intuition because you think something's important, not because you can see immediate applications. It calls you. And we've been doing this stuff for 4,000 years, the mathematicians. So we do have a collective intuition, which I can't really put my finger on. But if you look at something, you think, gee, that smells good. I think I'm gonna follow that. Follow your nose, I guess. Okay, so now I'm going to go back in history. So I'm looking at mechanising reasoning. I'm quite towards the end of the talk. You'd be possibly pleased to know. So one of the very first people to try and mechanise reasoning was Raymond Lull. And that's not, by the way, he wasn't smoking. That's actually little words coming out of his mouth. Right. So Raymond Lull. So he invented a reckoner about the aspects of God. I'd like to think of this as like, do 12 Hail Marys or something like that, right? Oh, you've done that, yeah, okay. Now we know what to do, right? To mechanise the aspects of God. And this is just from one of his books. This is the first prima figure. And Lull based the notion that on the idea that there are a limited number of basic undeniable truths in all fields of knowledge, and that everything about these fields could be understood by simply studying combinations of these elemental truths. Right? And he actually used these figures to try and convert Muslims to Christianity. Look, didn't work. But I think we'll move forward to Leibniz. Now, Leibniz was a very fine mathematician in the, the 17th century, maybe 18th, I can't remember. And so he believed aside from being a co-inventor of the calculus, he believed that much of human reasoning could be reduced to calculations. And he had a thing called the calculus ratius sonata, which resembles symbolic logic. And he said, the only way to rectify our reasonings is to make them as tangible as those of mathematicians. And so we can find our error at a glance. And when there are disputes among persons, we simply say, let us calculate. Without further ado, we'll see who's right. I like this. I really think this should be done with law, legal stuff, When you have this court case, instead of having to pay all that money, you just let the calculations run and see who's right, and then you'd be happy. Actually, I remember a science fiction book called Monument by Lloyd Biggle Jr., where that's exactly what happened. So what about calculation? Well, calculation goes back way, way back. The earliest examples of algorithms we know of can be found in, for example, this cuneiform tablet. This is an ancient Babylonian one. It was a calculation of the square root of 2, base 60, by the way, because that's what they used. And it's correct to as many decimal places as I've written out. And Archimedes had a method of calculating the area of a circle, because circles are very basic things. And he said, well, if you have a circle, to calculate its area, what I'll do is I have my circle, I'll put a square around it. That's a pretty good approximation. You say, well, what about this bit on the side here? Well, you say, okay, I'll put an octagon around it. Well, that's pretty good. What about this bit? Then you go, okay, I'll put a 16agon around it. And he kept doing this, and he did it with a 96agon. And he did it on the outside and on the inside, and that gave him a good calculation of pi. Interesting fact. And this method actually still influences us today. So if there are mathematicians in the audience, this is the origin, really, the origin of Lebesgue measure, inner and outer measure, because that's what we do. So historically, there were lots of calculation materials, such as logarithm tables, that be glad over there you didn't have to learn them. Yes. Astrolabes for calculating positions, along with clocks for where are you, longitude and latitude. Abacuses in China. Most historical mathematics was concerned with calculation. To my knowledge, every device that had been invented was the task specific. I want to integrate, I build an integrator, differentiate, I build a differentiator. So back to logic, and then the story flows quite into the origins of modern computing. So in the West, logic began with the Greeks. And so he studied forms of arguments called syllogisms, and this is an example of a syllogism. All humans are mortal, all Greeks are humans, therefore all Greeks are mortal. I used this when I gave a talk to U3A, which was possibly an error, but anyways. Not mortal, So while the Greeks didn't have any symbolic representation, they worked in a rich logic, which we now call predicate logic, which would now convert this into symbols and make it look like this. For all x, if x is a human, then x is mortal. For all x, if x is a Greek, then x is human. Therefore, for all x, if x is a Greek, then x is mortal. That would be a symbolic representation of this in this logical predicate logic. If I had, for example, some Greeks have children, I'd say there is an x. X is Greek, and there is a y, such that y is the child of x. Now, it doesn't really matter. Suffice it to say there's this very rich logic where you're allowed to talk about not just properties of which are true and false, but properties are true and false depending on how you interpret the property. So, for example, like bx might be x is a boy. If I pointed at John over there, then that would be true. If I pointed it at somebody who wasn't a boy, it wouldn't be true, right? So there are different interpretations. These are called propositional variables. Okay. So why do we care? It's again really nice that again we come along a philosophical question. This is called the Unscheiden's problem. And the most famous mathematician of his generation, someone called David Hilbert, asked for a decision procedure like truth tables. Is there a truth table-like procedure which determines whether predicate logic is true or false? If I give you something of predicate logic, is it true or is it false? He wanted a formal system where everything that's true can be proved within the system. So you have rules of inference like modus ponens, and can you prove things in the system? And finally, because a proof is a special kind of algorithm, and finally he wanted to know, are these systems consistent? Is mathematics consistent, or is it based on a big lie? That's bad. And the way to think of this is, can we create an algorithm, a machine, into which one feels a statement about mathematics, and at the other end a decision emerges, true or false? Can we produce proofs of all the truths in that system? And can we prove the consistency of mathematics? We can't prove a contradiction. And he didn't state these as questions. He said, this is what I want you to prove in 1900. And this is because people in that day thought of the universe as this ginormous clock that was wound up and would gradually, and it was all deterministic. Everything was deterministic. Quantum physics hadn't been invented, all that kind of stuff. Well, the Dark Lord arrives. So Leibniz's and Hilbert's dreams were forever shattered by the ideas of a young mathematician called Kurt Gödel. This is later in his life when he was at the Institute of Advanced Studies, a brilliant 20th century logician. And he proved these remarkable theorems called the incompleteness theorems. And he proved, so any sufficiently rich formal system has statements expressible in the system, true of the system, so I can write the statement in the system. It's true. I can observe that it's true. But the system cannot prove it. So these systems are incomplete. I don't have enough axioms or reasoning power to prove that it's true. You go, oh, no, they'll just add it to the system. Oh, no, because as soon as you add it to the system, there's another one. These systems. So his conclusion, or at least conclusions of later people, was thinking must remain creative. We can't. You can challenge this, but you must, depending on how you view minds. And even worse, no sufficiently rich formal system can prove its own consistency. Well, that's kind of disturbing. right? All of mathematics is, we can't even know if it's consistent. That's somewhat disturbing. So the collective intuition of a generation of mathematicians were wrong. I won't worry about the last sentence in view of the time. But maybe there's hope. This was talking about proofs. Proofs, remember, a special kind of algorithm. The Einstein's problem, undecidable, asks for the defeat of any mechanical method, not just a proof. What's the problem? Well, the problem is, what's a mechanical method? What is a mechanical method? To answer the question, we need to define what a mechanical method actually means. And this is a philosophical question. It's not really a mathematical question. Anyway, Turing, Post, and Church proposed models of computation. And Turing had this model he called a Turing machine, which is now universally accepted. And he did an analysis of what people did. And he said, look, we think about, if I'm doing something mechanically as a person, I have a finite number, my brain's finite. I'm willing to agree with that. I'm very finite currently. And what I do is I look at something, and according to what I see and according to my internal state, I do an action. Right? And his action was very simple. He had an infinite tape, and he said, I'm either going to, if I'm in state 7 looking at a 1, I'll move left. If I'm in state 8 looking at a 1, I'll move right. If I'm at state 25 looking at a 1, I'll print a 0 or something like that. And he said, this is a very simple model of computation. And what he did was he showed that almost every function, well, lots and lots of mathematics could be converted into this, anything you've ever thought of. And he claimed this actually captured the notion of intuitive computation. So why Turing? Well, Turing gave this conceptual analysis, giving what many regard as a proof that Turing machines capture what's computable. This analysis is the fundamental contribution of Turing's paper. And I'll put this reference up. This is Turing as a young lad, which is a very sweet picture. And of course, Turing was famous for Bletchley Park and, the war effort, saving millions of lives from the submarine attacks. He considers an abstract human computer, he said, by limitations on the sensory and mental apparatus, we have a fixed bound on the number of symbols, our brains are finite, a fixed bound on the number of squares, a fixed bound on the actions we can do. And he argued that this proves that any function calculated by an abstract human is computable by a Turing machine. So in other words, we've got an answer. And I like this quote. Gandhi said, what Turing did by the analysis of his processes, the limitations of calculations of a human being, was to show that calculation can be broken down into the iteration controlled by a program of extremely simple, concrete steps. So concrete that they can be easily described in terms of physical mechanisms. Now, why do we care? What influence could this possibly have on humans? A bit of philosophy. He also had this idea, which also came from Gödel, that you could digitize things. Data could be turned into programs. So instead of building a machine, you had a single machine and you wrote the description of what you wanted to do on a tape and feed that into a machine. This is a very profound idea, right? So in particular, let me say it this. These are Turing's own words in 1947. The special machine may be called a universal machine. It works in the following quite simple matter. When we have decided what machine we wish to imitate, we punch the description of it on a tape of the universal machine. The universal machine has only to keep looking at the description of the machine to figure out what to do. Now, you may think this is an absolutely profound idea because it says that all of this stuff is data. This is completely obvious to us now. This is where it came from. People had never thought of this before. And you may say, oh, this is kind of obvious, but it's not. Let me just go down the Howard Aiken quote. This guy was a famous US scientific computer person. He said, if it should turn out the basic logics of a machine decide for the numerical solution of differential equations would coincide with the logics of a machine intended to make bills for a department store, I would regard this as the most amazing coincidence I ever encountered. This was the US computer expert of the time. So it's an incredible fact that this stuff, this amazing idea was so long and penetrating, and it's now everywhere. And this is where computers came from. computers came from this. McCulloch and Pitt took Turing ideas and they showed how to physically implement them, along with Johnny von Neumann, and the first computers that came out were EDIAC in 1945, coming directly from these philosophical things. And von Neumann was well aware of the fundamental importance of Turing's paper, which described the principles of a universal computer, digitization. Many people have acclaimed von Neumann as being father of the computer. I'm sure he would never have made the same mistake himself. He might well have called himself the midwife, perhaps, but he firmly emphasised to me, and others I'm sure, that the fundamental conception is owing to Turing. Now, von Neumann was probably the most brilliant person who's ever lived in many ways. I mean, he was incredibly fast. You know, people used to line up outside of his door, literally, to have their problems solved. So these are lifetime problems, and he'd walk in and von Neumann would solve them on the spot, supposedly. It was somewhat depressing. But I often wonder, and this is, I'm getting very close to the end, I'd like to reflect on some morality as well, and also governance that we should have over science. And even though he was brilliant, let's wonder about his view. He came from Europe, Hungary actually. And first off, he said, when you drop bomb, when you drop little boy, drop it on Kyoto, because it'll have a greater effect on the Japanese, because that's their spiritual home. And it was only that one of the generals liked Kyoto, who was on the committee, and said, no, we want to keep Kyoto for after the war, right? And then he famously said this in a quote to Congress. If you say, why not bomb them, the Russians, tomorrow, I say, why not bomb them today? This is after the war. He wanted an immediate atomic attack on Russia. And if you say today at 5 o'clock, I say, no, why not 1 o'clock? So even though people can be extremely smart, one wonders about the morality there. And this is relevant to, I've got a couple of slides to go and then I'm done. So I'd like to talk about modern algorithmics. So far, the algorithms I've talked about have been algorithms where you're like a mother and you're worrying about your child, right? And what you do is you write down all the things, like if this happens, like do this. If this happens, do that. You know, if you run across that, well, you know, you're looking after the house. They're going to look after the house for you. You're heading overseas and you don't want things to go bad, and you write down all the possible things that might happen, right? They're the kinds of algorithms I've really talked about, where we tried to think through in advance all the interactions that might occur. There's lots and lots of stuff that says, no. What we're going to do is, that's not the way we evolved to think. What we do is we provide an architecture and let the algorithms themselves evolve, right? That's what's going on. So have algorithms where you're basing it on the brain and the way we learn. So the idea is to abandon thinking in advance how to best do a task and let some evolving process do it. The cleverness is designing how do you actually implement that. Now, one of the very early examples was, again, Turing in chess and von Neumann. This was in the MCMC, Markov chain Monte Carlo simulations of the atomic bomb. But it makes us also reflect upon what's intelligence. I remember hearing Kasparov in 2012 in the Alan Turing Centenary Conference saying he felt there was deep intelligence. So Kasparov was a chess champion. He famously got beaten by a computer program, Deep Blue. Deep Blue was trained on lots of chess programs and beat him. And he felt that he was playing against an extremely intelligent human when he was playing against it. This kind of worried him. He felt there was an intelligence there. This one's even more interesting. These are all trained on these kinds of things. This one here, AlphaGo, is even more interesting because it's a general learning program. What it did was, instead of training it on lots and lots of classical chess programs, it was to learn Go. What they did was they said, look, here are the rules of Go. I'm going to divide your brain in half. Let the right half play the left half. And it learned to play Go by playing itself. I somehow find this disturbing, that this thing became incredibly smart, at least at Go, just by playing against itself. And, you know, you can imagine you could do this with general learning procedures. You just say, this is the way to learn, Go and observe the world and learn. Interesting stuff to think about. Okay, so how does this work? It uses massive computational power, neural networks, which are a series of differential equations which model the action of neurons. And reinforcement learning is like training a dog. When it does well, you say, good, here, have a biscuit. When it does bad, you say, no biscuit. And quick smart, it learns to do the right thing. There are problems because you might arrive at what's called a local maxima or a local minima, but we have mathematical ways of getting around that. Deep learning is you just have series of these drills, networks. Well, let's not worry about that. And there are other methods. There's statistical learning, probabilistic techniques. Some of my works involved algorithmic randomness, which is concerned with this stuff. I should mention we live in the age of statistics. I hope you're going to go to the talk given by Richard Arnold about statistics, which is coming up by the Wellington Royal Society, where he talks about statistics is not the problem, because I like this. H.G. Wells was a science fiction author. He said, statistical thinking will one day be as necessary for efficient citizenship as the ability to read and write. I don't think that's true yet. Currently, what am I doing? I'm working on a model of what's called online computation. There is no abstract model for this. I'd like to have a model. I'd like to be able to say, this is these structures like graphs can describe online computation. Online computation is, you're a triage nurse. Patients are coming to you. You have to order them in a priority list. There is no model of this kind of computation, which is a really interesting fact. And it turns out some of the stuff that I did in, believe it or not, something called computable analysis may be useful. Maybe not. We'll see. It's harder than I anticipated, as it's turned out. So here's my summary. So we live in the most mathematical age of all time. There is absolutely no doubt about it. Mathematical techniques lie at the heart of almost every device we interact with. It's absolutely the fact. I've given a brief account of some history of how we got there. Logic was the mother of, well, not all of this, but certainly some of this. I pointed out a couple of things to which I've contributed, and I want to point out that all of this came from Blue Sky's research. At no stage were we thinking about, oh God, we must do this, that, or the other. We were thinking, this smells good. We're going to chase this, and it turned out to be useful. And just before I go to the very last slide, but I want to play you something. Thank you for listening. Thank you to the Marsden Fund for 20 years of research. Thank you for my colleagues from Victoria University I've had lots of fun with. My postdocs who are scattered around the world. My wife, Kristen, who's an extremely tolerant person. Thank God. and my family, I guess, too. But you may think that this is all about scientific stuff. It's not going to have any impact on, like, the creative arts, for example, which somehow gets separated out. I'd like you to listen to something. Maybe not. First question, what is it? It's a slip jig, but that was done by a computer. You know, music is one of the great creative arts. This was trained on 25,000 bits of Irish music and came up with an album which, there was an album which half the music was, it was played by people, but it was half the album was constructed by a computer. It was acclaimed by the Irish music magazines. And then 6 months later they said, well, actually, you know, half the albums were done by a computer and people couldn't tell. So you've got to be very, I think the future is an interesting thing. And I think given the morality of lots of stuff that goes on, I think, you know, proper governance and oversight is really, really, really important. It's something we should totally all be aware of. Anyway, so now I will go back to this. Thank you very much for listening. You've been a good group, and I hope I've offered you at least some insight into what's going on. Thank you.